Marine Corps JROTC. It's time to start our citizenship and our patriotism periods of instruction. The first one is going to be our freedom documents. Our freedom documents are a series of speeches and documents that embody the core of our beliefs, our values as a nation. Even before we were a nation, there were people throughout the colonies who sat around and talked about the principles of our country and what we thought at that time we should stand for. After the United States did come into existence, and to this very day, those issues continue to be discussed and those principles are often refined. In order for us to truly and effectively know what our citizens are responsible for and to be knowledgeable citizens ourselves, it's important that we understand our democratic heritage. Most Americans know that the Pilgrims and others came to America to have the freedom to practice their religion, and that others wished to escape tyranny or to seek economic opportunity. Many of us, however, take these freedoms and rights for granted. During this period of instruction, I'm hoping that we can revisit these rights and privileges and build on the remainder of our citizenship and patriotism classes. These blessed United States are very diverse in our population. We live in a country where people from different environments, people who practice different religions, and people who have different cultural and ethnic backgrounds can come together. The bottom line is, though, regardless of where we came from, here today as a U.S. citizen, we are all Americans. Many of our American values are rooted in famous documents and speeches that provide us with a basis for what we believe and what we hold dear as a nation. And it evolves every single day. But we got to remember the core of our American values and the core of our American beliefs, which were written in the Declaration of Independence and established by the Constitution of the United States. The objectives of this bit of instruction are to be able to list the characteristics of a freedom document. You're going to be responsible for matching information about a specific document to that actual document. And if we were one-on-one, then we would be responsible for providing a visual and an oral presentation. You would be responsible for getting into groups and providing a PowerPoint or a speech or a presentation so that you and your group would be able to display that you have an understanding of the values behind the specific freedom documents. We're not going to be responsible for that during this virtual lesson, however. Like all of our classes, we got keywords, but the keywords for this class are the actual documents that we're going to be covering during this bit of instruction. The first one being the Mayflower Compact from 1620, Patrick Henry's Call to Arms in 1775, the Declaration of Independence, which was read out loud on July 4th, 1776 for the first time, the Constitution, which was written in 1787, but ratified in 1788, but only with the promise of the Bill of Rights to come later in 1791. The Gettysburg Address in 1863, and I Have a Dream speech written by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and spoken in 1963. In our Ethics, Morals, and Values class, and then subsequently in our Marine Corps Values class, we learned that the Marine Corps values, honor, courage, and commitment, were tied directly to the foundations of the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution of the United States, the American values. What is right, what is wrong, what is good, what is bad, etc., etc. So where did we get our American ideals from? Where did we get these ideas of freedom and human rights, etc., etc.? They come from the Greek, Roman, and British, and a lot of our American Indian practices are values and standards that were incorporated into a lot of our freedom documents. Many of our ideals, I should say, were forged in colonial times. That time frame between the first European settlers and the time we decided to declare our independence. They have been tempered, meaning they've been changed and they've been updated by time as we become more and more influenced to change and to grow as a nation. It's no secret that a lot of our founding fathers made some mistakes. That's not a secret, and we're not in a race culture type of mentality. We want to be able to learn from our mistakes. So what is great about these documents is that although the people who wrote them were not perfect. They wanted to create a more perfect union. They knew that if they wrote them a certain way, it would provide us, as we grew as a nation, an opportunity to change and update with the times. The first document we'll discuss is the Mayflower Compact from 1620. I hope we remember our elementary school history classes about the Pilgrims landing at Plymouth Rock and the Mayflower. Before the Pilgrims ever set foot on American soil at Plymouth Rock, they got together and decided how they were going to work together. The Pilgrims actually set the model for government in the colonies. In the Mayflower Compact, I should say, the Pilgrims decided that they would pass laws for the good of the entire group. And many point to the Mayflower Compact as the document that set the tone and was the basis for the concept of majority rule. When you look at today's government, the three branches, specifically the House and the Senate, when they are voting for laws, that was all rooted back to the Mayflower Compact. The Pilgrims decided they would pass laws for the good of the entire group, as opposed to what was best for a king or queen or their nobles and their courts, all the big wigs and the rich people. A couple of key lines from the Mayflower Compact that definitely made their way into the Declaration of Independence and specifically our Constitution is, in the presence of God and of one another, covenant and combine ourselves together into a civil body politic, meaning we are coming together as a group to politic for what's best for ourselves, for our better ordering and our preservation. And by virtue hereof to enact, constitute, and frame such just and equal laws, ordinance, acts, constitutions of officers meaning like the elected leaders, from time to time, as shall be though most met and convenient for the general good of the colony. Again, the general good of the colony, not the individual king or queen that they had become accustomed to. Let's fast forward 155 years. Colonists had been living here for a little over 2 generations, depending on how old they were when they arrived, through a series of taxes over the years, through the lack of representation of colonists in British Parliament, and after 155 years of mistreatment by the kings of England, we as colonists had reached our boiling point. There were many founding fathers, and there were a lot of people involved in our official declaration of independence from England. One of those gentlemen was Patrick Henry, who at the time was the first governor of Virginia. Patrick Henry was a very passionate man. At the time of his speech on March 23rd, 1775, he was very aggressively questioning his colleagues, asking them like, hey, why are we even bothering trying to come up with a peaceful resolution? We have failed at a peaceful resolution for over 100 years. We are not being taken care of. We are not being treated properly. We are being taxed to death, and we don't have anyone in Parliament representing us. So he decided to give this speech on March 23rd, 1775, at the Virginia legislature, which at the time it was known as the House of Burgesses. Although a very lengthy and passionate address to the House of Burgesses, the most famous line is one of the last. Forbid it, Almighty God. I know not what course others may take, but as for me, give me liberty or give me death. This has rung in the ears of school children since the day that speech was given. It might seem a little weird to have a speech in a class about our freedom documents, but it was that speech that lit a fire in the Continental Congress to take action. There were many of the founding fathers that were on the fence about whether or not economically, financially, personally, professionally, that going to war with England, declaring our independence from England was the right thing to do. A quick note about Henry is that Patrick Henry was also remembered as his as someone who opposed the adoption of the Constitution in its original form. He felt that it gave too much power to the federal government and endangered the rights of states, but most importantly, the rights of the individual. He thought that the way it was written presented itself too much like a monarchy and less like a democracy. As a result of his opposition, he was influential in the creation of the Bill of Rights, which we'll talk about a little bit in this class and a lot more in its own separate class. But it was the promise of the additional add-ons, if you will, the Bill of Rights, that ultimately led to the ratification of the Constitution in 1788. After years of debate, the Continental Congress finally came together and agreed that it was time to break ties with England. The Declaration of Independence is just that. It's the declaration stating, hey, you guys, we're out of here. The Declaration of Independence was read aloud on July 4th, 1776. Of all the documents written and of all the speeches made prior to us deciding to separate from England, there were no other clearer calls for independence up to the summer of 1776. In Philadelphia on June 7th, the Continental Congress heard Richard Henry Lee of Virginia read the opening remarks, if you will, the resolution. Resolved that these united colonies are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states, that they are absolved from all allegiance to the British Crown, and that all political connection between them and the state of Great Britain is, and ought to be, totally dissolved. After Richard Henry Lee's resolution was read, the Continental Congress brought 5 dudes together to write the Declaration of Independence. The Committee of 5 to write the Declaration of Independence was John Adams, Ben Franklin, Roger Sherman, Robert Livingston, and Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson was the principal author of the Declaration of Independence, mainly because he had a reputation of law, he had a reputation of literature and science. He was very articulate. He had a very peculiar and detailed expression in words. So, not that the other framers of the Declaration of Independence, were illiterate or anything. He was just the best at writing. That's the easiest way to put it. On July 4th, 1776, the Declaration of Independence, like I mentioned earlier, was read out loud the first time in Philadelphia. It's important to know what the 5 parts of the Declaration of Independence are, not just because you're going to get tested on it. The introduction states to the world why the colonies were going to break their connection with England. Now, this was important because we needed to gain an economic relationship with other countries. We needed to let the world know why we were breaking ties with England so that we could get their allegiance in case we needed it, specifically France. The preamble basically says, hey, this is the treatment of an 18th century Englishman. This is the way you're treating, or supposed to, every citizen under your charge. Colonists didn't consider themselves colonists. A lot of them didn't consider themselves Americans. They considered themselves Englishmen. And they didn't think that the principles of the way Englishmen were being treated is the way they were being treated at the time. And it is the duty, when you're not being treated as such, to revolt. The third section identifies as the abuses of the mother country towards the colonies, the financial burden, the ridiculous taxation, the lack of human rights. At the time, King George III was the King of England during the American Revolution. The fourth section basically goes over all of the efforts and everything that the colonists had done up until that point to peacefully resolve their differences. And then finally, they were like, you know what? This Patrick Henry dude, he's right. Give me liberty or give me death, because I have kissed your rear end for 155 years. We have done everything that we could to come to the table and meet in the middle and say, hey, we're a part of Great Britain as well, but you're not treating us the way we believe that we need to be treated, or even remotely close to the way you're treating your own countrymen. So screw you guys. We're out of here. The fifth section, the conclusion, if you will, states that the colonies should be free and independent states and absolved and free from the crown, an independent country. After the introduction of the Declaration of Independence came the preamble to the Declaration of Independence. I'm sure that we all, or I hope we all, remember this from elementary school. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. I don't want you to get confused with the preamble to the Constitution, we the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, etc., etc. Now we're getting to the meat and potatoes, probably the most important document on planet Earth, the Constitution of the United States of America, adopted September 17th, 1787. This was 4 years after the end of the Revolutionary War in 1783. We had been working on it for quite some time before the Revolutionary War ended, but officially it took at least 4 years for this thing to come to fruition. Although our Constitution is the longest surviving document of its kind, and it's the model for other democracies across the planet, it didn't happen overnight. It wasn't developed overnight. You got 1787 is when we really started to structure the framework for what our Constitution was going to look like. After the Revolutionary War from 1775 to 1783, the new nation found it very difficult for us to work together under the Articles of Confederation, which were kind of like a loose confederation of the sovereign states, formerly the colonies. These articles provided an opportunity, and they allowed for the 13 states to continue conducting themselves independently and free from each other, which caused a bit of problems. This loose confederation was just a matter of dispute for about 4 years after the war, and it took everyone sitting down and taking these Articles of Confederation and rewording them and turning them into what we would know today as the Constitution of the United States. The Constitution was developed under the leadership of George Washington. He wasn't specifically a framer, but he was responsible for getting all of the states' representatives to Philadelphia in 1787 to start developing the framework for what we would see today as our present form of government. The form of government was kind of new because there were 3 branches as opposed to just having the king or queen and their court and maybe 1 legislative branch. We have the executive branch, the legislative branch, and the judicial branch. And at some point, we'll talk about the Great Compromise, about how our form of government is set up differently than a lot of other nations with 2 legislative branches, but that's for another time. The Constitution is very long, and it can be somewhat arduous to read, but I want to hit some of the highlights so that you have a better understanding of what makes up our Constitution. The preamble is very important because it defines the purpose of the document, why this thing is written. And this is very important and probably very familiar to some of y'all who took history in previous years. We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and to our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. So now we know why the Constitution was written. Let's talk about some details of the Constitution. And the remainder of the Constitution is going to define how the government is going to operate. Now, these are just the highlights. Each article is very, very long and very, very detailed and very, very arduous. Article 1, legislation, establishes the legislative branch, specifically the Senate and the House of Representatives. I would ask that you Google the Great Compromise, and you'll understand why we have a Senate and a House of Representatives. And in our government class, we will talk in detail about what these do. The Article 2 establishes the executive branch, which, for lack of a better analogy, is simply the president and his cabinet, carries out and enforces federal laws. Article 3 establishes the judicial branch, which is responsible for the federal court system, to include the Supreme Court. Article 4 defines the relationship between the states and the federal government. Article 5 establishes the ability for future generations to amend the Constitution if society requires it. We're going to talk a little bit about that as well. This is one of the things that's phenomenal about our Constitution and those that established it. They knew that our nation was going to change and evolve, and they provided the leeway in the way the Constitution was written to allow us to do that. Article 6 talks about debts, supremacy, oaths, and basically what this means, it requires anyone in Congress, any judge, the executive, meaning the president, or anyone serving the government in any formal capacity, to include soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines, to swear an oath to the Constitution of the United States of America. Article 7 talks about ratification, meaning the adoption and the implementation of the Constitution. This article details and lists all of those people who signed the Constitution, the 9 of the 13 original states that were needed to ratify the Constitution. It took a little while. Congress established March 9th, 1789, as the date that we were going to start operating under the new Constitution. It took about 2 years to get all the states to approve or ratify the Constitution. And if memory serves me, I want to say Rhode Island was the last holdout, and they didn't ratify the Constitution until like 1790, if I believe, which is kind of weird. Like, wow, we bust our butt, we have a revolution. Why would it take so long to ratify and to approve this Constitution? Well, every state had their own ideas about what right looked like, and they were responsible for taking care of their own state. So there was a lot to discuss and a lot to write and rewrite. But in reality, 2 years really isn't that bad. The only way the states were going to ratify the Constitution was with a promise of an additional 10 amendments, aka the Bill of Rights. Patrick Henry and many others, like I mentioned earlier, were opposed to the Constitution in its original form. But with the promise of the Bill of Rights to come a little later, specifically 1791, all the states agreed and said, hey, okay, we'll ratify the Constitution. The way it is written is okay, it's good to go, but we need to add some things. Let's get it signed and let's get it going. Let's, in 1789, begin operation under this current Constitution, but we got to work on the additional amendments. And the Constitution was written to add amendments to it. Like mentioned, once it was written, it still required the ratification or the aka approval of 9 of the 13 states before it was passed and adopted into the law of the land. But during this entire evolution of the development of the Constitution, the new country was kind of split into 2 major groups. One was in favor and one was against ratification. The Federalists were for supporting and ratifying the Constitution the way it was. Bill of Rights, no Bill of Rights, the way it's written, that's the way it needs to go. And they lean more towards a federal government having a bit more power as opposed to a state or an individual. Some of those, again, they were kind of back and forth, but they leaned more towards that. Some of the major and more popular Federalists who were writing these documents and publishing them across the new nation were James Madison, who became later on the 4th president of the United States, Alexander Hamilton, who was one of the gentlemen responsible for how we managed our finances. He was a founder of the Federalist Party. He also founded the Coast Guard and the New York Post. Now, these are not testable items. These are just kind of fun facts. Oh, by the way, there was a whole Broadway show about that guy, too. And then you got John Jay, who was just an American statesman. He was very popular at the time. He was a good negotiator and a patriot. He became the 2nd governor of New York and the 1st Chief Justice of the United States. These are just some. These are not all of the Federalists. The Anti-Federalists, however, published articles and made speeches in opposition to accepting the Constitution. Some of the more popular were George Mason, which was an American planner. He's a politician. He was a very high bigwig in Virginia. And then, of course, we've already spoken about Patrick Henry. And then Elbridge Gerry was a politician and a statesman. He served as the 5th president under James Madison. So you got the Federalists, who are for the adoption of the Constitution, the Anti-Federalists, who were against the adoption of the Constitution, at least that version without the addition of the Bill of Rights. Like mentioned, the main concern of the Anti-Federalists was that the Constitution didn't have a Bill of Rights, individual rights that would protect the rights of the individual person, what their quote-unquote unalienable rights are, and then the rights of the states. We needed to work together as a federal government, but each state had its own atmosphere, its own political responsibilities, its own responsibilities to its constituents. You know, you have things that were going on up in the north that were very industrial. You had things that were going on in the south that were very rural and farm like responsibilities, and each state needed to make sure that their rights were protected under the Constitution. And the way it was written, that wasn't the case. It was that promise of an additional Bill of Rights that ultimately led to the ratification of the Constitution, roughly 4 years or so in the making. So let's talk about the Bill of Rights. The 10 constitutional amendments to the United States Constitution. Number 1, the freedom of religion, press, and expression. Number 2, the right to bear arms. Number 3, quartering soldiers. Now, this one really doesn't equate to today's society, but basically what that means is back in the day, the European countries, when they were at war, they had a responsibility. You, as a citizen, had a responsibility as these armies are passing through your town for them to be able to take up residence in your home without permission. That's not a thing, and not anymore. But it was written into the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, I should say, because it was a thing back in the day. According to the Third Amendment, you as a homeowner did not have to quarter soldiers unless you gave them permission to do so. The Fourth Amendment talks about the search and seizure responsibilities and the rights of the government, the rights of the individual in that process. The Fifth Amendment talks about trial and punishment, and the Sixth talks about right to a speedy trial. The Seventh Amendment is your right to be tried by a jury of your peers. The Eighth Amendment discusses what cruel and unusual punishment is. Now, this one is still debated to this day, and this starts back in the day from hanging, and it's discussed all the way up to today through lethal injection. That's something that I don't think is ever going to stop being debated. The Ninth Amendment talks about the construction of the Constitution, meaning the ability to add more amendments as the country grew and changed. And then the 10th Amendment specifically speaks to the states' rights, the responsibilities of the federal government as it relates to their relationship with the state and their individual constitutions. You're going to get a separate Bill of Rights class, but let's talk about some specific rights that have been amended to the Constitution. Beyond the 10 that we already spoke of, the Bill of Rights, let's talk about some other significant amendments. The 12th Amendment was pretty important because it changed the way we elected our president and vice president. Today, the president and the vice president are running mates, meaning I'm going to vote for both of them together as a team. Opposed to the way it used to go, the vice president was the runner-up to the president-elect. That did not sit well with the relationships between the vice presidents and the presidents prior to the 12th Amendment. The running mate model is very, very conducive to getting business done the right way, opposed to the vice president and the president being from two opposed parties and not willing to work together. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery. The 15th Amendment um, gave the right to vote to everyone based on race or color, with the exception of women. But the 19th Amendment gave the right to vote to women. Let's fast forward to the American Civil War. About 87 years after the Declaration of Independence was signed, and about 75 years after the Constitution was signed and ratified, and about 2 years before the American Civil War ended, President Abraham Lincoln delivered a speech during the American Civil War at the dedication of the Soldiers' National Cemetery in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, on the afternoon of November 19th, 1863. 4.5 months after the Union armies had defeated those of the Confederacy at the Battle of Gettysburg. Now, I think this is one of the most well-known speeches in American history. The Civil War brought about a lot of change, and during the decade of between the time the Civil War started to about 1870, there were a lot of documents that were developed by the government that provided for greater freedoms for a lot of Americans. Some of those documents are the Emancipation Proclamation that freed the slaves in 1862, as issued by Abraham Lincoln. Then we've got the 13th Amendment in 1865 that abolished slavery in the United States. Then we've got the 14th Amendment in 1868 that helped define citizenship, meaning born free, born a slave, color, race, creed, sex. All of those things were, believe it or not, kind of loose in their definition in the original version of the Constitution. So this 14th Amendment defined what it meant to be a U.S. citizen. And then we had the 15th Amendment, which was adopted in 1870, and we spoke about this a little bit earlier, which provided for the voting rights of former slaves and prohibited anyone from being or not being allowed to vote based on race or color. The speech given by Abraham Lincoln, aka the Gettysburg Address, was given at a dedication ceremony for a cemetery at Gettysburg. The cemetery was dedicated to honor soldiers on both sides who died because this was the bloodiest battle in the American Civil War. Fortunately, it was a turning point for the Union side. But I always wondered about the speech when I was a kid. I didn't understand what 7 years ago meant. I've heard that repeated a million times. Had no clue until someone sat me down as a teenager and said, "Hey, a score is 20 years. So 4 equals 80 and 7 years." Meaning, as I give this speech, it has been 87 years since the Declaration of Independence was made. Although this speech has been rewritten and produced and turned into film and radio about 1 billion times over the years, there were a swarm of reporters there. There was a swarm of Union and prior Confederate soldiers there, politicians and the like. But there were only 2 confirmed photos of Abraham Lincoln. One of them is the one you see in this picture here, and then I got it highlighted in the center. I can't find the other one or what it looks like, but I thought this was kind of cool. Nothing to do with the class, just kind of neat. Hey, look, there's Abraham Lincoln. The speech itself was 270 words, about 10 sentences. And in the speech, he goes on to talk about where we came from and where we need to go as a nation. He talks about ending the war. Like I said, this was about 2 years before the official end of the Civil War. And he talks about ensuring that we are living domestic and tranquil lives with one another. But at the end is one of my favorites. Here's a quote: "That these dead shall not have died in vain," talking about the Union and Confederate soldiers. "That this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom, and a government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from this earth." Pretty powerful. Let's fast forward an entire century to 1963 and the "I Have a Dream" speech by Dr. Martin Luther King. Now, you would think that we would have gotten our act together by then, but as a nation, we are continuing to grow, and we will continue to grow. Almost exactly 100 years after Lincoln delivered the Gettysburg Address to a small town in Pennsylvania, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. delivered a famous speech on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial before thousands of people. Dr. King's I Have a Dream speech rings in the hearts, the minds, and souls as much in Americans today as it did in 1963. Unfortunately, like Lincoln, Dr. King was shot before he had the opportunity to realize his dream. His I Have a Dream speech was held in Washington, D.C. at the Lincoln Memorial because he was inspired by Lincoln's words, and his words inspired the civil rights movement. His speech opens up with a tie-in directly to Abraham Lincoln's Gettysburg Address. 50 years ago, a great American, in whose symbolic shadow we stand today, signed the Emancipation Proclamation. This momentous decree came as a great beacon light of hope. Due to the limited time we have together during this period of instruction, your pre-work was to have watched the I Have a Dream speech in the link provided in your learning management system. Although we don't have time to watch the entire speech, I would like to read the most powerful lines, in my opinion, from the speech. Let freedom ring, and when this happens, and when we allow freedom to ring, when we let it ring from every village and every hamlet, from every state and every city, we will be able to speed up that day when all of God's children, black men and white men, Jews and Gentiles, Protestants and Catholics, will be able to join hands and sing in the words of the old Negro spiritual, free at last, thank Almighty God, we are free at last. Very, very powerful words, a very, very powerful speech that set in motion policies and procedures and change that continue to this day. The last freedom document I want to talk about is one that's lesser known, and it's called the Americans' Creed. In 1916, right before the United States entered World War I, the editor of an education journal at the time developed a national writing competition, and the idea was to foster patriotism and civic responsibility among U.S. citizens, to kind of gear them up to what we as a nation believed our responsibilities were leading into World War I. One of the members of this competition was William Tyler Page. He's the one who wrote or won the competition, I should say, with the Americans' Creed. Now, William Page was at the time a member of the House of Representatives, and in 1919 he was elected clerk of the U.S. House of Representatives, which he held for the rest of his life. The speech wasn't that long, but we're going to hit the highlights just the same. Some of the things that he talked about in the Americans' Creed was the belief in the United States of America as a government of the people, by the people, for the people, whose just powers are derived from the consent of the governed, meaning we are giving the government power. We are the governed, but we consent to being governed a certain way by electing those we want in charge of us. A democracy in a republic. A lot of people talk about the United States as a democracy. Make no mistake about it. We're a republic. A sovereign nation of many sovereign states. A perfect union. We are one and inseparable. We are established upon the principles of freedom, equality, justice, and humanity, for which American patriots sacrificed their lives and gave their fortunes. I therefore believe it is my duty to my country to love it, to support its Constitution, to obey its laws, to respect its flag, and to defend it against all enemies. I'd like to think that even before this class, you were intimately, or at least somewhat familiar with the documents that we talked about today. But I want you to understand that it's important to hold these documents sacred because they represent our ideals and our values, and I hope they represent the aspirations of what kind of citizen, what kind of person you want to be as you grow older. I want you to develop and foster a sense of patriotism and pride in your unit, the school, your community, our state, and our nation. I want you to develop a civic responsibility. I want you to understand that you are responsible to make sure that you're voting when you come of age, that you're giving back to your community, that you are responsible for your input and the forward progress of our society. To paraphrase the Gettysburg Address, the world will note and will long remember what we've said here. What you say can go a long way, but what you do will last forever. I hope that you've gotten something out of this period of instruction. I hope that you understand why these documents are important and how they have become the foundation of what our nation believes, of what our core of cadets believes. The next periods of instruction are going to lead into the 3 branches of government. We're going to talk about the economic systems of government, and we're going to talk about political systems of government. All of these tie into your patriotism and your citizenship blocks of ROTC. Semper Fidelis, hoorah, and a yut yut to you.